Buddy. Okay, welcome. Whether you're here in the room or zooming in to this, which is the fourth session of the Spring 24 workshops in the history of material texts. I'm Jerry Singerman, who's formerly humanities editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press and one of the current conveners of the workshop, along with Zachary Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and John Pollack, Curator for Research Services at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. We're kept on track in this endeavor by our graduate assistant, Lila Goldenberg, of the Penn History Department and the Bristol Sternberg Fellow in the History of Material Text.
All different than any other.
But of course, none of us would be here doing what we do every late Monday afternoon during the academic year were it not for Peter Stallybrass, who set us down this path some 31 years ago and who continues to inspire us to ask questions those on the outside might find odd. How did people used to make writing disappear? Why does God the Father look so young in some of his pictures? Into what old children's book should one look to find hidden copies of Fanny Hill? What small but significant part of Christ's body would have survived the resurrection, and so forth. Some of you know what I'm talking about. This and much, much more. And these seminars are always the better and smarter and livelier for Peter's presence, and we're delighted that he's here today. A few housekeeping matters for those of you who are in the room. Please sign the attendance sheet that Lila is circulating. And if you're not already on the listserv and would like to be, please add your email address. Also, in consideration of our remote attendees, we ask that when the time comes for discussion that you be sure to speak more loudly than you might think necessary, so as to be picked up by our somewhat rickety audio system right over there. But something's happening? No? Confirm my speaking language. I don't know. Okay. Okay. My speaking language is New York. I don't know. For those of you who are joining us remotely, please mute yourselves during the talk, of course, but make yourselves known while silent by using the chat function, which Lila will be curating. And later, during the Q&A, please use the raise hand function so that we may call upon you to hear from you directly. Now, it's my special pleasure this afternoon to welcome Jessica Brantley, who last presented at this workshop too long ago, that is in the fall of 2011. Jessica took her undergraduate degree at Harvard and then did an MPhil at the other Cambridge in medieval and Renaissance literature. From there, she went on to hone her art historical and manuscript skills in a year of independent study with James Marrow and Lucy Freeman Sandler before heading off to UCLA, where she completed her PhD in English literature. Since 2000, she has taught at Yale, where she is the Frederick W. Hillis Professor in the Department of English, a department that she also currently chairs. Brantley's interests in the material world of the Middle Ages, and more specifically, its material textualities, have extended on occasion beyond works written and illustrated on vellum. She examined text and image in alabaster, for example, in her co-edited volume, Reassessing Alabaster Sculpture in Medieval England. But it is as a scholar of manuscripts and reading that she has primarily made her mark. She is the author of Reading in the Wilderness, Private Devotion and Public Performance in Late Medieval England, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2007, and winner of the MLA Conference on Christianity and Literature Book of the Year Award. More recently, she is author of book that I will pass around, Medieval English Manuscripts and Literary Forms, which was published in the Penn Material Text Series in 2022. Now, this latter is a book that serves both as a superb introduction to the nuts and bolts of manuscript study, and one that reveals just how the tools that Brantley assembles can be used to move us from examination of the physical object to consideration of the theoretical, conceptual, and yes, literary matters. She makes such moves in a set of 12 case studies, the particular selections dictated in part by the requirement that each manuscript chosen be digitally available in its entirety for further study. and the analyses of each focusing on a particular question about ownership, miscellaneity, authorship, textual mediation, etc. But there's more to the principle of selection, and it's something I find quite shrewd and paradoxically counterintuitive. That is, each of the case studies focuses on one or another of some of the most celebrated of all medieval English manuscripts, the A-list, if you will, and therefore the ones about which we think we know. So Cotton Vitellius A15, the Beowulf manuscript, or Cotton Nero A10, to which alone we owe the survival of Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or British Library Manuscript Additional 61823, our only access to the Book of Marjorie Kemp, or the Ellesmere Chaucer, one of the earliest, most beautiful, most authoritative manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales, and so on. So each is so famous for what it contains that we may rashly conclude that there is an almost too obvious payoff from looking at it. But Brantley shows us an even greater payoff that comes from looking again and carefully and asking the right questions of the physical manuscript. And if those are the questions we do well by asking of the Beowulf or the Gawain manuscript, shouldn't we start by asking the same of any manuscript with which we're working? And I think the answer is definitely yes. Now, Brantley has for some time been asking questions of a kind of manuscript known not for its textual uniqueness, but rather for its ubiquity, that is, the Book of Hours. And that, of course, is the topic of her presentation this afternoon. I'm quite sure that I'm not the only one in this room who hasn't thought as much about Book of Hours as they should, and who knows about them mostly for the pictures, as distinguishing one from another. I am sure still that I'm not the only one, however, who will have a much better, more intelligent, and more nuanced understanding of their illustrations, texts, and readers in just about an hour and a half. So with no further delay and with pleasure and anticipation, I cede the floor to Jessica Brantley.
Thank you, Jerry, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm especially grateful to Jerry and Zach and John and Lila and everyone who helped to arrange this event. I am really happy to be here at Penn and grateful for the invitation. I'm especially excited to be able to offer a piece of my ongoing book project on literacy and the literary in the late medieval Book of Hours. And I should apologize for some confusion over the title. I had originally planned to bring you new work on the Vernon manuscript and the Sherborne Missal, but given the ongoing difficulties in accessing the British Library's digital collection after the cyber attack in 2023, I decided that it might be better not to do that. And I should say that it also has scuttled my plan to have all dozen case studies in my book relate to digital facsimiles that are fully and freely available, because of course at the moment they're not. So that's been difficult for all of us working with that collection who are used to having those things so readily available. But the other reason I decided not to bring you that work, if I'm honest, is the somewhat inside baseball nature of that particular topic. So I've changed my plan, and I'll be talking about Books of Hours, as Jerry said, and I hope that no one will be disappointed not to hear more about septenaries this afternoon. So to start the Zoom, I'll share screen. Okay.
Get rid of the appendices.
Minimize the. So my book project, which I'm tentatively calling A Literary History of the Book of Hours, reads these prayer books in their relation to vernacular literature in England. And here is an opening from the Saxby Hours, an early 15th century English manuscript, to remind you of what these objects are like in their material form. Rather than offering a history of art or a history of prayer, the more common rubrics for approaching these volumes, my study excavates the histories of reading that are manifest in this uniquely large and therefore uniquely important textual archive. By opening up these histories of reading, I hope to move beyond merely noting the explosion of books of hours in the 15th century to incorporate that explosion and those manuscripts into the ways in which we understand the vernacular literature of the period. Although books of hours are most often known to modern scholars and museum goers as beautiful books, heavily illuminated luxury objects, and this one is an obvious example, though it's actually a sort of middle of the road book of hours in terms of production values. But their images aren't separable from the texts they contain, nor from the practices of reading and interpretation they promote. Books of hours play an important part in the history of reading in late medieval England, and not only the history of literacy, but also the history of literature. To use Sheldon Pollock's useful, if somewhat unwieldy terms, I would say that the Book of Hours as a genre participates in both literization, that is the growth of written culture, and literarization, that's the unwieldy part, the growth of literary culture. From a numerical perspective alone, it is obvious that the hours shaped late medieval reading. These small portable prayer books, often but not always illustrated, represented the most popular form of reading across Western Europe in the 13th through 15th centuries. More books of hours remain in modern libraries than any other kind of book from late medieval England, almost 800 handwritten volumes and many thousands of printed ones. From Europe at large, the number of manuscripts alone has been estimated at around 10,000. Their survival rate suggests, though of course it doesn't absolutely prove, that these books were very widely read, and even that a late medieval reader would have been more likely to encounter a book of hours than any other kind of bound volume. As Christopher de Hamel has put it, there was probably a book of hours in almost every substantial 15th century household, especially in France, the Netherlands, North and South, and England. For many medieval families, it was probably the only book they ever owned, and for countless of our ancestors, it was probably the only book they had ever seen. Ubiquitous and singularly so, the Book of Hours is usually understood as the primary instrument of private reading, enabling new connections between individuals and their books, and expanding the reach of literacy in the later Middle Ages. Even more significant than their numbers, though, is their role in the formation of lay literacy in medieval schools and households. Children learn to read through the devotional habit of saying their hours. Many kinds of evidence suggest that this genre of book shaped medieval readers' earliest experiences. The Book of Hours is known in England, for example, as a primer, primarium in Latin, a word that probably indexes the book's status as first. Many of them incorporate alphabets and catechetical material at the start, such as this example from the Morgan Library that begins with a cross, unusually here a St. Andrew's cross. The primer alphabet is known as the ABC or the cross row, and it usually begins with a simple cross, prompting the child reciting the letters to start by saying, "Christ cross me speed." Following the alphabet, the primer material includes the three most basic prayers of medieval Christianity, the Paternoster or Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria or Hail Mary, and the Credo or Apostles' Creed. In some examples, these texts are followed by more catechetical material in sevens, here are the septenaries for you, virtues, vices, deadly sins, works of mercy, etc. Here's another example of this kind of book from the Bolton Blackburn Hours in York, which begins with a full-fledged crucifix and a Veronica or Holy Face in the P of the Paternoster. After the cross, the alphabet continues with two A's. Y is something of a mystery, as the two forms of the letter here seem very similar, but in other examples they seem slightly different, open and closed A's, like the two forms of A in use today. You can see that this alphabet is concerned to present not only the letters' sounds, but their various graphic instantiations, as there are also two forms of R and two forms of S. I don't know if I can point to that here, but here are the two R's and the two S's along that, I'm sure. At the end, the alphabet concludes with abbreviations for et and con, three tittles, est, and amen. So all of that is here. Est, amen, with a period. Beginning with the image of a cross and a spoken petition for divine help, Christ cross me speed, and concluding with amen, the medieval alphabet is already a prayer. As Chris Cannon points out, however, it is also a poem. Rhythm and rhyme help young learners then as now to remember the letters in sequence. The connections between literacy and poetic language in the primer's alphabet, faint though they may be, raise a larger question of how the late medieval Book of Hours participates in cultures that are not only literate, but literary. Even given their central place in the history of literacy, it must be acknowledged that the Hours are not an archive in which critics have ever hoped to find rich literary experience, especially in vernacular languages. Because the constitutive text of the Book of Hours, the Little Office of the Virgin, is an unvarying set of Latin prayers, modern readers have deemed the genre verbally uninteresting, aesthetically unambitious, and insusceptible of interpretation. But the Book of Hours comprises more than this text alone and more than basic catechetical material. It almost always contains both sequences of illustrations and numerous ancillary texts that complement the Hours themselves. A compendium of multiple texts and systems of images, these prayer books reveal a rich hybridity of representation to be a central feature of late medieval reading. These books weave together many structures of meaning in an inescapably material way, revealing how common and how necessary was what Sylvia Hewitt has in another context called polytextual reading, reading absent texts alongside present ones, vernacular captions alongside Latin prayers, static images alongside developing narrative ones, and of course, pictures alongside words. The paratactic and simultaneous relation among these multiple systems of signification that is definitional for the genre of the Hours constitutes the most common reading experience of the late Middle Ages. And this complex understanding of what it meant to read, of how a person might engage with a book, has enormous but unexplored consequences, I think, for our sense of how medieval literary culture worked. In particular, and this is my primary interest today, evidence both broad and specific reveals that English manuscripts of the Hours engage visibly with vernacular literature as part of the reading cultures that help to create or shape it. Books of Hours deserve a more prominent place in English literary history, for they help to limn the contours of literariness itself in the late medieval period and can contribute to a definition of literary experience as it was coming into being. Of course, defining the literary in the Middle Ages or in any period is a difficult task, and making absolute pronouncements is probably a fool's errand. Definitions of the literary that rely on a text's susceptibility to interpretation, an author's intentional creation, or the complexity and richness of meaning that readers can find seem far distant from the many medieval texts that are devotional, didactic, or otherwise practical. But another category of the literary that is easier to track in medieval texts might be defined by its commitment to form. The ordering, binding, and patterning of language might be seen as literary function, and these can be found in many kinds of medieval works. If authors are naturally associated with literary qualities like effects of voice and ambiguity, then perhaps scribes and readers can be associated with other kinds of literate experience, those that prize malleability, practicality, and the formal structures that enable aesthetic experience. Seen in this light, Books of Hours can help to generate a new and more capacious sense of the medieval literary, redefining an idea of literary experience out of medieval readers' everyday engagements with their books. These everyday engagements create conditions for reading that have explanatory force for literary aesthetics. For if this kind of reading is fundamentally prayerful and has therefore been segregated from secular vernacular literature, it nonetheless aligns with other kinds of reading in ways that can broaden our understanding of the relations between medieval people and their books. Practices of devotional reading, which were the most foundational kinds of reading practices for medieval readers, intersect here with other kinds of literary experience and even support them. As scholarship over the last several decades has increasingly shown, the theological is not to be categorically isolated from vernacular writing. I'm thinking here, of course, of Nicholas Watson, for example, his work culminating recently in Balaam's Ass. And Bruce Holsinger's work on the importance of liturgy as the great medieval frame narrative, his words, that fuels medieval literary production is also essential to this point. Holsinger's powerful insight that medieval liturgy is not to be divided from literature, but rather remains imbricated with it in ways that modern categories of study have obscured, reveals that the liturgical culture that produced the Book of Hours also produced some of the most familiar monuments of English literary history, for example, Cadman's Hymn. As a part of this sweeping argument, the Book of Hours offers a valuable particular case, nuanced in ways that are important for the ongoing revelation of liturgical ways of knowing at the heart of literary history. For it is significant that Books of Hours are not exactly liturgical. They show the impress of liturgical forms on private practices, but they are not service books. And if this in some ways makes it easier to demonstrate the ways in which liturgy connects with literature, the Hours are the linchpin that holds the two together across the clerical-lay divide, it also turns the argument away from sacramental ceremony and towards practices of private reading. The Book of Hours, one might argue, is precisely where the liturgy first meets the literary, precisely where performed spectacle becomes readerly experience. Another way to think through these definitional problems would be to observe that scholars spend a lot of time carefully dissociating the literate from literature and the literary in the Middle Ages. Readers are generally cautioned in two directions. First, the importance of performance in medieval culture means that there can be literature without the literate. Oral formulaic compositions such as Beowulf are aesthetically driven, even though they're not written down. And in both early and later medieval cultures, people who could not read could still have literary experiences through hearing texts read aloud. On the other hand, literate productions do not always imply texts that have been called literature. The movement of verbal culture from spoken to written modes, from oral to literate, does not necessarily mean that the culture is becoming literary in the heightened sense dependent on a concept of the aesthetic or a non-utilitarian reception or participation in an acknowledged writerly tradition. Literization does not mean literarization, in other words. But maybe we are wrong to divide the literary from the literate so sharply, and perhaps on the contrary, there is something about the medium of writing that helps to create or develop the literary aspects of medieval literature. The qualities of the literary are being worked out in material terms in the late Middle Ages through a mixture of self-conscious media forms, so that the literate, i.e. the written down, and the literary, i.e. the high poetic, let's say, do help to establish and define each other. Mixed media call attention to this fact. Writing itself is a self-conscious media form, and literature often has to look like literature on the page. I'm thinking of examples here such as the layout of verse, in which poetry signals its identity as poetry through the way that it looks. Moreover, if there are pictures on the page, one notices the look of the words as words. Illustrated books have always engaged the question of the literary, as many celebrations of the aesthetics of the written word are denigrations of pictures. The agon between the sister arts of poetry and painting often operates as a zero-sum system, as devolvements of the Gregorian dictum, for example, that would defend the value of pictures only as aids to the illiterate, for example, in comics and children's books. For a late medieval example, one might think of Rosemary Wolfe, who dismisses the interest of the illustrated religious lyric in the 15th century by comparison with what she considers the higher literary achievements of the unillustrated 14th century ones. By contrast, one of the largest claims of my project is that the mixing of media is itself an early and important locus of the literary. This is also still one of the most unstable and exploratory claims of the project. So I'm hoping that you can help me as I think it through here. As I said to Jerry on the way over, I'm at a moment in this project where I really just am eager to talk about it with people. So I very much welcome your engagement with the smaller and the larger claims of the project. One way in which verbal forms open a space for literary experience, that is when they allow for the crossing of media boundaries. A multimedia environment such as the Book of Hours allows for this flexibility of forms. If the genre of the Book of Hours helps to condition literate practice, that is, the reading, writing, and circulation of text, what is the view of literary culture perceptible from its vantage point? What does literary history through the mixed media of the hours look like? Many paradoxes emerge to be untangled. To begin with, these books are both Latin and vernacular, elite and popular. They derive from liturgical monastic life, and yet they structure the private devotion of the laity. Created collectively by a number of hands, they often represent quite personally one individual or family. Books of Hours are instruments of reading, but they are also objects for looking. They induce ephemeral performances of spoken prayer, but they also rely on their silent materiality to carry amuletic or talismanic meaning. They have quotidian functions, but also transcendent ones. The Book of Hours can be a family record book, a scrapbook, a textbook, but it can also be a means to eternal life. Books of Hours are particularly intriguing as a class of books strongly associated with women, even though women are a group often imagined to be largely excluded from literate culture in the Middle Ages. The paradoxes embodied by the Book of Hours, then, exemplify many of the contradictions and complexities of late medieval literate culture and offer a particularly nuanced vision of late medieval literacy. One of the dichotomies most fundamental to modern understanding of the Hours is the sense that these books are both rigidly formalized, composed of a number of standard prayers in Latin, that is, they're all the same, but also flexibly personalized. Eamon Duffy has examined striking examples of how the idiosyncratic piety of individual medieval people is reflected in their prayer books. As Duffy shows, books of hours offered multiple opportunities for their readers to express a customized and personal piety, including owners' names, family histories, special prayers and charms, and bespoke portraits. But seen from another perspective, these books offer opportunities for expression of other kinds too, aesthetic and especially literary. In the one-off additions that people make to their books of hours, one sees not only the lineaments of their piety, but also the aesthetic shapes of their reading and writing. What Daniel Wakeland has called ordinary writing appears in these volumes: brief jottings, casual notes, and also everyday uses of formally ornamented verse. I want to use the remainder of my time today to offer one concrete example of all this. Only one example, but a rich enough one, I hope, for us to think with. The example comes from a 15th century book of hours, Trinity College, Cambridge, MS B.11.18. Here's the opening of the Mass of the Virgin. The manuscript is not particularly exceptional. In fact, it could be fairly described as quite common Sarum book of hours, circa 1440. It was, for example, probably made in the Netherlands for the English market, like so many of the middling books we have. Its unexceptional decoration shows some evidence of workshop production. The catalog describes the illustrations as rude, but very soft in execution. There's a poetry of the catalog description. And you can see here that the border designs of the text pages and the image pages are different, suggesting that stock images might have been tipped in after the writing of the manuscript. Its texts, too, are largely what one would expect. Along with the hours themselves, one finds a calendar, memoriae of saints, the office of the dead, expected prayers such as O Intimorata and Obsecro Te, and so on. But for all its familiarity as an object, Trinity B.11.18 provides a representative case and an opportunity to think about how manuscripts of the hours were casually used as a repository for poetry, and even a platform for the reading of secular verses. The formal Gothic textura of the book's original scribe contrasts with the cursive Anglicana hand of an acrostic rhyme royal stanza celebrating a woman named Catherine. The vernacular poem, whose first line is "Causer of my joy, health, and comfort," was added on a blank verso a short time after the professional production of the book, seemingly by a reader who thought it would be valuable to record in this context. Here is the brief poem in full. I'll somewhat modernize the Middle English. Causer of my joy, health, and comfort, all is in you, my heart's lady dear. Truly as you list, right so I may report, your servant to be, daytime and air, right as you will. But this I you require, in way of service as lowly as I can, never to change, but take me for your man. The sense of the poem is tricky to interpret. Given its pious context, some have assumed that the writer was expressing a special devotion to St. Catherine by including it. The Digital Index of Middle English Verse, for example, describes the text without hesitation as addressed to St. Catherine of Alexandria. Indeed, the recto of this leaf contains an unambiguous prayer to the saint, and this is the prayer that is concluded in the textura lines that you saw at the top of the verso page. This is the recto, but it concludes above the poem. There's no image of Catherine in the manuscript currently, but a parchment stub, which I think you can see there, suggests that it has been cut out. And devotions to other saints include a full-page picture opposite to the beginning of the prayer. So here is St. George, for example, the previous saint in the book. But I think it's not certain that the poem expresses a commitment to St. Catherine and her cult. Here is the poem again, in a detail, and then perhaps more helpfully there with a transcription. The familiar language of service to a lady toggles easily between secular and sacred devotion, in an example of the phenomenon Barbara Newman has called crossover. It's hard to imagine, moreover, what kind of reader copied this poem into the manuscript. Usually, so-called accessory texts are assumed to connect the owner to the book. For example, an added prayer might index a special devotion on the part of the owner, perhaps to a name saint. But it seems unlikely that a woman named Catherine would demand of her name saint, "Take me for your man," or would beg for her constancy. Despite the assumptions one might make based on the poem's material context, then, it is at least possible that the Catherine named here is not the saint, but an earthly love. Kenneth Wilson has called this a fugitive piece of secular verse. And I have to say that in the exchange of service between the speaker and the Lady Catherine, I hear courtly echoes at least as strongly as devotional ones. Whether this vernacular poem speaks of secular devotion, sacred devotion, or some powerful combination of the two, it goes beyond devotional utility to add aesthetic pleasure to the experience of reading this book. The short poem is highly patterned, not only in its rhymed royal verse form, one that traditionally connects piety with high literary style, but it's in its acrostic, a verbal pattern that ornaments the beginnings of lines as rhyme does the ends. And incidentally, the 26 acrostic poems listed in the digital index include both tributes to secular ladies and tributes to the Virgin in about equal numbers. So this does seem to be a form that works across the sacred-secular divide. Unlike rhyme, however, the acrostic cannot be easily heard. It shows instead a kind of formal play with the look of the poem that can best be appreciated on the page. A reader can see the name Catherine down the left side of the verse more easily than a listener can hear the name in the initial sound of each line. The name works as an unspoken and unheard visual representation of the poem's subject, its verticality working against the operative horizontals of the verse lines. In the speaker's pledge to serve his lady, the daytime and air, this poem perhaps capitalizes on its position in a prayer book, similarly committed to constancy in temporal terms. That is, the round of prayer in a book of hours follows the hours of the day and the night. There's a bit of a textual crux here, I have to say, because it's clearly a long R that the scribe has written here, daytime and air. And he does need that R for the sound of the rhyme, to rhyme with lady dear. But one might have expected daytime and eve. And although I think it's not a V, the R and the V could easily be mistaken for each other by a scribe. At any rate, the scribe's effort to preserve the pattern of the rhyme with air is telling. Although the poem was added after the professional conceptualization and execution of the book, it is nonetheless carefully designed to bring an aesthetic, literate, and one might say literary appreciation of Catherine into its pages. It's so difficult to pin down satisfactorily the notoriously shifty qualities of the literary that one wonders whether the concept itself is flawed. Untangling literary writings from non-literary ones seems perhaps pointless when medieval readers and writers themselves did not necessarily hold a hard line of separation. Scholars have recently and rightly embraced all kinds of writing as a part of literary culture, observing fewer distinctions along the lines of aesthetic form or fictional purpose. And yet the category of the literary as literate is useful as designating one kind of writing that exists alongside many other kinds, one kind of verbal experience that enables particular forms of expression. Among many things, one kind of thing that literacy can do is to allow writers and readers to express themselves through attention to language as a visible thing, attention witnessed by texts that are highly patterned, aesthetically motivated, and differently valued. Tracing the relation of this kind of writing to all other kinds is valuable and illuminating. So in this project that I'm in the midst of still, I'm exploring the literary history of a genre that has been more often approached by historians, and specifically art historians, than by anyone primarily engaged in the study of medieval texts. By bringing the Book of Hours into vernacular literary history, however, I do not mean to suggest that we should set the prayers of the hours alongside the Canterbury Tales, just to say, as exemplars of late medieval achievement in letters. They are on most levels very different things, beginning with the fact that the Tales is most readily thought of as a text, while the Book of Hours is always and mostly a book. But the insistent materiality of this book as an object brings important perspective to histories of literature that might otherwise remain disembodied. So this is one version of the essential insight of the field of book history as a whole, that physical forms shape literary forms, that the history of material texts, the Book of Hours in this case, can influence the interpretation of immaterial texts, literary history writ large. And although scholars of Chaucer are certainly interested in the manuscripts in which his poetry is found, now more than ever with the identification of scribes continuing apace, the inescapable thinginess of the quintessential late medieval prayer book has still more to offer to a discussion of textuality in the period. We can learn from the literary histories of non-literary objects, from the ways in which they interact with, engage, both shape and are shaped by the fields of production with which students of medieval literature have been more familiar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Wonderful presentation. And the floor is open. Davida.
Click out of the stop sharing.
Thank you so much for a very fascinating talk. A couple of times you talked about young readers. And I want to think a little bit more about who would have been learning from these texts. And it seems unlikely to me that these beautiful, extremely expensive books would have been put in the hands of young children. I mean, especially if it was a family owned object. So I wonder if it was an object of maybe adult literacy for women who, especially because they're not only becoming in some way literate, but also in Latin, maybe particular women who were particularly known to be devout or wed, stood out in some way. And one of the reasons, and this is completely, out of the blue evidence, but, even that acrostic, as you mentioned, you would have to know that the name was Katrine or whatever, in order for that to be helpful in any way as an object of learning literacy. Whereas there are a lot of scholars of the Hebrew Bible who look at the Psalms and how some of the Psalms seem to have had a pedagogical function, and particularly the alphabetic acrostics.
Yeah. Right.
So if the woman was supposed to appreciate the acrostic, maybe she knew the vernacular alphabet, and maybe if you knew the vernacular alphabet and then you were starting to look at prayers that were familiar to you from having said them many times and sort of pieced out, it seems to me more of an adult function than a children's.
Yes, thank you for this question. It's very, very interesting and complicated in all the ways that you point to. So there are, I showed you some alphabets at the beginning of books of hours that are full books of hours, and that are not particularly fancy or valuable objects, but nonetheless are valuable family objects. But there also exist alphabets in so-called primer alphabets, and Michael Clancy has done a lot of work on these, that are just that first choir, basically. So not the full book of hours, but just the catechetical material. And some of them are in Latin, some of them are in English. Some of the alphabets are in Latin and some are in English. You can tell whether they have W's and thorns in them, right? That makes it an English alphabet. And the prayers are taught both in Latin and in English. And it's not absolutely true that the vernacular ones are the little pamphlets and the Latin ones are the full books of hours, though it is largely true. And I think what people generally assume is that, yes, children had some of these things, and scholars will talk about, seeing the traces of dirty hands on, like a child's dirty hands on a book or a manuscript, but that also some of them were used within families to teach literacy to children by adults, so that they were used both by adults and children. And certainly adults can learn to read from these objects as well, right? It's not necessarily only children who are learning this way, but I think there's ample evidence that in some cases it was children. Some of the books of hours have larger lettering and seem to be more accessible to children, I guess I'll say. The interesting connection between the alphabet and the acrostic is another thing I think is very rich and interesting. So there are alphabetic poems, Chaucer's ABC, the Hebrew Psalms that you're talking about. That's not what this is, right? This is something where you would need, this is not for learning the letters of the name Catherine, but there's a pleasure involved in having the alphabet and then being able to deploy it in this way and being able to see it. And again, it's not something that could be appreciated or heard. It would have to be appreciated only by looking. So this is not someone hearing prayers only, or, repeating language that has a kind of sonority that is familiar. This is someone looking at a page and noticing the letters and being able to identify them and spell out the name. So I think that's really fascinating as well, to connect the practice of acrostics as a kind of playful advance that is possible once you have the letters of the alphabet.
Just question, in your universe of English books of hours, about what percentage have the alphabets in them? And also question, the alphabet that you showed was clear, it was not the first page in the manuscript. There was text on the
In the Bolton block
verso before. What was that preceding text?
I can't remember. I think that the understanding of that book is that it has been disarranged, and that the alphabet would have been at one time the first page. What percentage? Very small percentage. I mean, the pamphlets are very ephemeral, and so we have, I'm aware of 3 or 4 of those. But there must have been more, I think, because they were a kind of objects that would hardly last. The books of hours that have alphabets, again, I'm aware of maybe 5 or 6. And there are about 800 extant English books of hours. I haven't seen all of them, but I have seen hundreds of them, and I'm interested, I was trying to get a sense of, a generic sense of these objects. But I can't claim to have seen them all, but I haven't, not very many, not very many is the answer to the question.
About the point that you made that a lot of these books were made in the Netherlands for an English market. And just was wondering more about that and their production, especially because I find the idea that the standardization of them kind of creates space for customization that kind of leads to literary exploration. As the classic. So is there like a standard in the Netherlands that's different from England, and how are they getting to it?
So in the 800 that I just mentioned, I'm including the ones that we believe were made in the Netherlands for English consumption. And we know that they were either because they ended up there or but primarily because they were made with the Sarum use, the English liturgical use. And so it seems clear that there was a market, that there would be artisans and artists in the Netherlands making them for people in England. So they would make Sarum books of hours in order to ship them over. And I don't know the details of how many or how that worked exactly, except to say that there was a lively market and there is a lot of scholarship on that. And it tends to be in the 15th century, and they have a certain look, the ones that come from the Netherlands. As a guess, I would say, perhaps as many as 50 to 75 of the 800 might be in this category. They have a certain look, and you can tell that they're emerging from workshops. And so there's another kind of paradox there, that there is no more medieval book than the Book of Hours, right? And yet there is the beginning of mass production here, some kind of production line where, these books, were made for a bookshop in the expectation that they would be sold. Yeah, so it is fascinating. It is really interesting. I think it is really interesting. And it is interesting that kind of mass production and workshop production and assembly line production that might have happened, again, sort of as the result of many hands at work, would then create a space for, as you said, personalization, or for an individual person to be able to have one, right, to be able to own one and to write in it.
Peter.
Did you have a question? Well, thanks very much, Jessica. That was wonderful. I was thinking about the notion of the literary on the one hand, and on the other, the notion of bilingualism. In other words, that it strikes me that a modern perspective assumes that Latin, it seems a very high prestige language, whereas most of my Indian friends grow up in a multilingual atmosphere. They move very easily between languages. And they're used to playing with, so acrostics don't seem to be necessarily so elite. They seem to be that, that many cultures many African cultures too. It's just normal
Mm.
to move between 2 or 3 or 4 languages in a way that it's not for a dominant language. So a paradox, it seems to me, monolingualism is often a sign of dominance.
Mhm.
We don't need to know other languages. And it seems to me that many kids, I mean, including someone like Joyce, who's clearly listening to Latin as a Catholic.
Yeah.
And something like Frederick Wake is full of childish, you know, he actually has these phrases like Lord have mercy on us.
Yeah,
Lord have mercy on us. You know, so
Right.
that these kinds of things are themselves mixing high and low languages,
Mhm.
which you get with Kyrie eleison, the sort of
Yeah,
famous
yeah.
thing of the priest trying to seduce a woman called Alison, you know, that goes
Right, right.
Alison to abuse. So you have a
And all the
sort of-
macaronic play of different
Right.
kinds of lyrics, and things like that, yeah. Mhm.
But then the other thing that strikes me is the sort of move away from the literary is what I mean, I think of it, that, you know, for us, for most of my students, anyway, poetry seems difficult.
Mhm.
Whereas the central book, far and away the bestseller in the late 16th and early 17th century, and throughout the 17th century, the metrical Psalms,
Mhm.
far more popular than the Bible. The Bible sold in a fraction of the metrical Psalms, which has music in it, and it actually says the metrical Psalms in verse. So in other words, the crucial thing, and it comes back to, you know, mnemonics, is certainly I learned the alphabet, I presume most people in America are singing it. You know, you say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it also rhymes, and so the G has to rhyme with P, which actually makes a nonsense of the alphabet, because I remember you go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P.
You have to get to P.
So you actually get rid of those things. And then there's, in England, you say Z, not Z.
Right.
And so I think you end up with Z, and I sing it on my head. Sing it in my head. I don't remember.
Yeah.
David, you won't remember what it was. In my head, on my head, I don't know what you said or something. But anyway, the singing and the rhyming, alliteration, all of these things are now very often seen as sort of elaborate literary strategies, as opposed to the first steps in literacy. In other words, to actually the very first step in literacy. And it seems to me that that's another area that may be very interesting to look at bilingualism and to look at children's games that can include completely people who aren't literate, never become literate with Latin. They'll
Right.
hear it in church, they'll hear it, they'll hear it above all through the Psalms. And so the Psalms have always been, both for Jews and for Christians, the most central part of the Bible, far more important than the other book in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so that you in a monastery, you do the Psalms every week, the whole book of Psalms every week. So,
Right.
you know, that you know it by heart.
Right, right.
So there's a way in which the question of playing with this language may be different from actually just removing in that sense. It may not be quite the same thing as.
Yes, well, I mean, this is what interests me about the literary and the literate together, because what you're talking about is a lot of different sound effects, which I agree have exactly the implications that you say, that they're mnemonically helpful, that they're performative, that the sounds, they have a kind of sonic life in the brain and the memory. And for people who don't fully understand, you know, children or people operating in a bilingual, multilingual environment in which they, you know, levels of understanding are complicated and gray, right? That there's not kind of on or off, you know, a language fully or you don't know it at all. And so that sonic dimension is important here. I guess what the acrostic poem allows me to do, and that the reason that it really interests me is that it is that like you can't sing an acrostic poem, because whereas rhyme is what organizes the kind of memory into sound for the verses, the acrostic poem is playing with something different, right? It's playing with the way it looks on the page. It's playing with something that can only be perceived by reading a written text. And so that is, and it's happening in the environment of a book that is clearly material. It's clearly to be looked at. It's the presence of the images. So I have a lot more to say at other times about the presence of the images in the books, but it's a kind of reading that is shaped by the physical object more than the sound of the letters. And yet it's the sound that gets you there. So it's kind of, you know, as you're saying, I think they work together. Bilingualism is very, very interesting. So often The hours are largely in Latin, though there are about 16 or 17 manuscripts of an entirely Middle English hours. But I'm not as interested in those as I am in this project, in the sort of mixing and the bilingualism. So the central hours of the Virgin are are always in Latin in a book like the ones I'm looking at. But the additions are often in the vernacular, and that can be additional poems such as the one that I showed you. It can also be the captions that are associated with the images. So I'm interested in, a Latin book with images and French captions, for example. That's a very standard sort of thing. Often the rubrics or the instructions for the Latin prayers are in French and English. So the books are largely bilingual. You can tell that they're operating in a bilingual world, but the patterns of use of the different languages, I think, are really fascinating. And so I'm interested in that. Sometimes there's a kind of bilingualism that seems more thoroughgoing. So I'm thinking of a book, which incidentally is one that people speak of as having been made for a child, in the Bodleian Liturgical 104, that has big lettering and pictures, and perhaps was used by a child, a royal child. People speculate about it. It has the interleaved hours of the Virgin and short hours of the Cross, which is something that happens often in English hours, that the two offices are interleaved. So hours of the Virgin, matins of the Virgin. But the hours of the Cross in this book are in English. So you have Latin, a Latin office interleaved with an English office. And so it's not exactly like a facing page translation, but it has that same kind of alternation, that you have this, you have that. And I don't know what that means pedagogically exactly. I'm still thinking about it, but it's a fascinating example of how bilingualism, the range of ways in which bilingualism works in these books, and a lot more for me to think about there.
David or Zach, did you have a question? Zach, then David.
Well, I'm still trying to think more about this question of the literary, and because it seems like you have these books of ours, which in themselves we might not call them literary, because they're fairly repetitious. They're kind of structured, it's like a prayer book that tells you what to do. So they're sort of not playful enough maybe to be considered literary, or they're not original enough to be considered. And then you have the acrostic poem, which sort of fills those in various ways, like with the crossroad, and also like playfully, seems to me, I agree with you, it seems very secular, playfully placed on the verse of the book, of the page about the same, who shares the name, right? So, okay, so I get that. So there's an interesting interplay then in your argument around these books that are not traditionally considered literary, yet they might be kind of prompts for literariness, or substrates for literariness, and there's this interplay between it's all handwritten, so there's like margin that it's the kind of like professionally written text, and the custom written text that is part of the literary review. So I guess I can see that with the acrostic. That's the example you gave us. I'm wondering, think of other things I would love to find on these books, that have to do with kind of thinking through language and image, or shape poem or something, like a book shaped with a cross or something to me. So what else is on the, why do you see these books? I mean, they're very common, so they would be the place where, it's the only book you've ever seen in your life. Yeah. And you feel like writing something down in a book, like it's going to be that book. So where do you see that line between the particularity of the Book of Hours prompting a certain kind of literary engagement, and then the materiality of the Book of Hours maybe just being the only place you have to write something down in your house, right? So I can see that with the acrostic, because I think there's a lot of interesting interplay there. Is that difficult? Or do you find, sounded awesome in the overview at the beginning, you sometimes just find, as you do with printed books, it looks totally random, like the interplay of the text, the base text, and the marginal or the added text. You see that in books of hours, shopping list or something.
Yes, I mean, you do, yes, you do see things like that. And there's a note in this book of ours actually about offerings made, note that I made this particular offering, things like that. So
Right.
there are,
See that as literate.
I wouldn't necessarily know. So a couple of things, I mean, these are good questions. I think, so the kinds of evidence I'm drawing on, some of it is like this. Some of it is the incorporation of vernacular texts into the planning of the book of hours. So this Hours of the Cross that I mentioned before in English is one of those. And versified, right? So it's a translation of a Latin office into English verse with the same kind of appeal as the metrical psalms, I think. Metrical psalms appear in books of hours. Poems of Lydgate appear in books of hours. The people familiar with Lydgate will not be surprised to learn that he is the author most often represented in books of hours. They're never identified as his poems, but there is a corpus of Lydgate's lyrics that appear in these books of hours. So there are, so you can amass a certain number of examples of this kind of thing. But I guess I'm interested, and so looking at vernacular, I started this project by wondering, I had seen, one too many descriptions of the Book of Hours as a Latin book, and I just thought, I need to know more about what vernacular language is in the books. And so I started the project asking that question. And so that is a certain kind of evidence coming from the books of hours themselves, like what is in there, and how do I see the engagement of these two cultures, the Latinate culture of the hours and the culture of vernacular literature, sort of materially manifest in these manuscripts that have both things in them, cheek by jowl. And yes, maybe it's because it's the only book that you have, but that means that it conditions your expectations of how literary culture works and what a book should be and how you should engage with it. The other question, and I'm not yet sure how much this is a part of this project actually, is about that conditioning element. Like if these are, I have many things to say about the structure of the Book of Hours and the way in which the polytextual sort of nature of representation and the rich variety that you find there conditions other kinds of reading. So that would be a question, if you've learned to read with the Book of Hours, if you think that reading is repeated in time in the way that the hours prompt you to do, if you think that reading is both textual and visual at once, if you think that reading is performative in the sense that you have a script to recite, if you think that reading is personal because you, and private, you have this object and it's yours and you can write in it. And if you think all of those things, then what? What happens when you read Going in the Green Light? And that's another way of asking the question. And I think that there are things to say about that. But at the moment, that's not the biggest part of my project. But I think that there are, I mean, certainly there are texts that come from the Hours. I mean, the Hours of the Cross is a text that, unlike the Hours of the Virgin, I mean, I'm also interested in narrative and image. So the Hours of the Virgin is a kind of pastiche of lyrical snippets, and not very much is happening that's narrative. It's often the images that go along with the Hours of the Virgin, however, are narrative. And so they tell the story of Christ's infancy or Christ's passion. And so you get images engaged in this very narrative work, you get kind of lyrical words, and I'm interested in that dynamic. The Hours of the Cross are, in fact, narrative. So that the Hours of the Cross tell the story of the Passion, and that is an inspiration to different kinds of vernacular expression. So one could trace, sort of all of the English vernacular engagements with that text and embroideries of that text, and see the influence of this kind of reading on other kinds of composition and other kinds of reading. So yeah, it's an excellent question. It really goes to the heart of what I'm trying to think about here. It's sort of in both directions. Yeah.
David.
I wanted to end up with the book of Marjorie Kemp manuscript, but a few other things first. I know a song for the ABC, which I think is a better song. Just Go Down with Barney the Dinosaur. It sings much better, but the point is there, right? Yeah. It's very singable, and you get fine out of it. Flanders, I think, is interesting because I think that's the center of the European money markets. It's the only place where you can do exchanges, financial exchanges. And places like Greece, there's a lot of spare capital slopping about, so therefore creating books with added value. With all these gorgeous illustrations, it's a good way of offloading capital.
Yeah.
So that's my belongings. And books of ours maybe as a medium for passing messages. That's one thing. The famous book of ours shared between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, right? Where they're sitting there, where they're passing messages. And he writes on the man of sorrow something, and he passes it to her, and she passes it back.
And poems, love poems. They write back and forth, don't they? Yeah.
There's also a wonderful manuscript in the Rosenbach in Philly, of Walter Hilton, of the sort of drone-like monks who supply the text for the women of science. One of the drones gets interested in one of the women and starts putting little messages in the margin. They go back and forth. And her name is Sewell, and he starts punning on her name. See well when you have read my.
Yes, Joanna Sewell and William Greenhalgh. Yeah.
And he literally gets sent to Coventry.
Yeah.
So there's all that, but it's the book of Marjorie Kemp is fascinating in an obvious way, of course, because she's reading, isn't she, when the roof of the church collapses on her head. She's miraculously only half brained, right? So that's right. And it's assumed that's a book of hours she's got there. Right?
Yes, that's right.
But the bit that fascinates me more, though, is when I first saw the book of Marjorie Kemp and Pam Robinson and turned the pages, those little illustrations of Bill's Knock, the miracle of Bill's Knock, where the Eucharistic hosts were not consumed. There's a little round circle with the dots in, which may be the blood of Christ. Or when they go to Aachen for the 12th clerics, there's a little shirt in the margin.
Yes.
And it blows your mind to think about your reading experience. And those things don't get into the editions. They don't get into the
That's
editions,
right.
but once you've seen them, you can't not think of them. So why do we not edit these things, put those things into the edition?
That's a wonderful question. I would be all for it. I think it's important. And those are marginal drawings, which seem to be responsive to the text, rather than.
The word marginal is sort of like they arrest your attention in a primary way. You see the image, and then you look at the text, and you just see a perfect kind of.
That's right. The margin comes first.
Cohesive balance between the two elements.
Yeah.
You're in a visual world at that moment.
And I think that it's not irrelevant that it's a devotional book, right? That what's being represented in the book of Marjorie Kemp is a kind of devotional experience, mediated by her own book of hours, maybe. But in this narrative, it's the same kind of experience that's being described. Yeah.
Oh, we have two comments from the chat. So Larry Silver says, Roger Week has identified a Morgan Library manuscript as being devised for a French royal princess of the useful stereo.
Yes, thank you.
And Wendy Pfeffer says, let us remember too that materials used for elementary education were less likely to survive than today. An ABC on a scrap parchment, for example, would suffice to learn the letters. That scrap is unlikely to survive. What I find noteworthy is that the poem addressed to Catherine seems to imply that Catherine could read it in any number of other texts as well.
Interesting, yes. I think, yes, scraps of paper, we can't expect those to have survived. And, also that kind of learning can happen on slates and wax tablets and all kinds of other things that are by design erasable and ephemeral. So it's very hard to put together these practices of literacy acquisition because we imagine that it happened with such materials. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, we know the words.
Mert, then you, then John.
We know the word ton partly just because they survived so long. I mean, in other words,
Yeah.
But in 1700, you're seeing the same exact Christ cross row.
Right.
So there must be thousands of them to transmit them. It's incredibly enduring as a form.
Which makes sense if it's the basic pedagogy. Yeah.
So feel free to ignore my question. I'll be happy if you prefer to answer it later. I'll try to keep it short because many people are into. So we know from the transliteration of Jamal Kapadar from Harvard University that they are evolving in the 16th century by the daughter of, and the author of an local notable, Sion, she was corresponding with two different Sufi order leaders. And there she was literate, certainly we learned it, and she was using this religious context, which allowed her to get some permission to learn literacy and build on it, to actually climb up in the social ladder. She even avoided marriage with the authority she got by convincing her leader. It was more like correspondences between a PhD advisor and a student, actually. And she used it to made her father or other patriarchal figures around her to accept her decision to refuse marriage because she devoted herself to Allah. And later, we know in the 15th, 16th century, like a lot of schools start mushrooming around Europe, like Bologna and either Ravenna, etc. And Oxford was part of Europe. So this use of vernacular, providing an alphabet, like a recipe to learn literacy, in the socio-political context of the island, what was changing? How could we position it? So we all learned from Georgia's question, like not many manuscripts had the alphabet, but vernacular was still used. So in the Canterbury Tales, we know that attention starts shifting to lower strata of society in this century as well. How can we position social and socio-politically this desire, this decision of the editors and the writers to use more accessible language and also include it out?
That's a very big question. That's a very big question. And it's not that I don't want to answer it, but I do think it's a very big and important question. And what comes to mind immediately is just that the Book of Hours itself is an indication of what had been monastic practice moving into a lay environment. And so it's an indication of lay interest and, in fact, great lay appetite for modeling what had been monastic practice and bringing it into a family, bringing it into a secular situation. And so it's not surprising that that would be a site for lay engagement and increased lay literacy, both in Latin and the vernacular, I think, not so much of a surprise, because the idea of this book is to make that kind of practice available to everyone. So I do, and this is the period, the 14th and especially 15th century, of their great explosion across Europe. So that was happening. The dynamic that you're describing was certainly happening around these books. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering about other sites that you see the text and images. So, for instance, like church, or something, just other ways that we formally interact with literacy and the culture. Just because I don't even Book of Hours isn't the only one, and it's significant that there are a lot of them, and that's why circulation. But I guess I'm just curious about how you position this and how also all your product line with other places, the text and images and lay interaction with their.
Yes, I mean, that's fascinating. That's a great question. And I do think that there are lots of, for example, wall paintings in churches that would operate in a similar way. Someone who could read, because someone who had been reading with the Book of Hours, would approach a wall painting with text in the same spirit, in the same way, maybe. Can we imagine somebody who could read the wall painting in their local church, but who couldn't do very much with a book? Yes, I think it probably also could work that way too. The difference seems to be in the monumentality of it and the sort of communal or public nature of the experience, as opposed to what has always been assumed to be the intense privacy of a Book of Hours. That an individual, it's a very small book, and it's a personal book, and so hard to imagine many people reading it at once. It's really for one person. So that's where I would be interested in the difference between those two things. But I do think that they are related. And Lydgate's verses get painted on the walls of the chapel and things like that. So there are crossovers even in terms of the particular text, particular kinds of text, particular authors between those two contexts.
I'm going to hop in before John. I mean, you've mentioned several times captions of the
Mm.
images within the books of hours. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about what kinds of images are captioned, what the captions say. Do the captions tend to be in the vernacular rather than in Latin? And you can, of course, imagine that, a captioned illustration is an aid to reading, right?
Mhm.
Because you use
Because the
the
illustration
image
helps you.
to learn how to parse the word. So I mean, it's a kind of entry level. I mean, do they function as a kind of entry level literacy, the captions, the illustrations? So anyway, would like to hear more about the illustrations that are captioned.
Yes, that's really interesting. They are in the vernacular very often, yes, and they tend to be narrative. So the captions will tell you what's happening in the image to make sure that you know. And I guess that's what I had always imagined, not that the image tells you that something's happening and then you can read the words. I mean, that's the way many children's books will operate now, right? That the image is an aid to the reading. I had been thinking of it more often in the other direction, that the image doesn't make that much sense. You see two figures engaged in conversation without the caption telling you that it's David and Nathan, you have no idea what's happening.
Yeah.
So, so I guess I would see it, at least in the case I'm thinking of, in that way. The case that I'm thinking of is the de Braille's Hours, which was made around 1230, 1240 at Oxford, and is often cited as the first book of hours because it was the first time the hours were separate from the Psalter. So the Psalter hours is an earlier form, and then the hours get detached. And Psalter hours continue to be made in the later Middle Ages, but Book of Hours as a standalone object is what is still popular. And the de Braille's Hours is often said to be the first. And it has a lot of interesting vernacularity in it, added prayers at the end, very localized prayers for particular Oxford friars, all of these narrative captions, all in French. So, so I'm interested in that particular object. But
Thank you. John.
This is great, thank you. Just a couple things. Your great point about other kinds of visuality does make me want to push you a little more on the sociology of your project. And yes, ubiquitous books of hours, and yet elite. I mean, I do think there's some negotiation about the access to the object and literacy for whom and in what context. The additional interesting point about Frenchness and when and where that is an available literate or literacy vernacular. And partly these
as
my own ignorance, it just seems like that's presumably going to have to be part of your study here.
French as a more elite language, you mean?
Right.
Yeah.
So, so I'll just throw out some things and you can do with them what you want or not, because I'm not super familiar, but part of this discussion is making me wonder if there is a church discourse about books of hours that is in some ways a useful clue to intended or unintended readings of them. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like, geez, I should sort of know that these things are everywhere, and yet I don't know if Salisbury had something to say about what the story should be. So that's one question. Another big question is there, you want to focus on English books of hours, but do you think your story is an English story? Or do you think what you can tell us is just as applicable to, other books of hours across the continent?
Mm-hmm.
And then the third giant thing, again, you don't have to answer this, because you did allude to the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of printed books of hours. And we all know this, and nobody, it seems to me, ever pays any attention to them very much. So can your story cross that border of print, or should it, or does it matter, or is that for somebody else to do? Thanks.
These are all great questions. And I will say a little bit about them. And I will take them away and cherish them and think more about them later. In some ways, the decision to focus on English manuscript books of hours is a practical one. There are 800 of them. It seems large enough. And I do think that the ubiquity of them, the sheer numbers, has prevented work on them. You say the printed ones, there are, tens of thousands of them, and I think, but no one works on them, and I think in some ways it's just hard.
Weird, isn't it?
Yeah, because there's so many, it's kind of hard to get a foothold. So I think those things are definitely true. Having said that, I do think that there is something, I mean, the English books of ours are different in some ways from what's happening on the continent. I think we often think of the Parisian one as the kind of template for all of them, but the German ones are a bit different, the Italian ones quite different, and the English ones different still. The English ones are early. Again, this one made in Oxford is often cited as the very first. So if Paris later took up the charge, it was a form that interested English bookmakers early on. And that's important to me. The English ones continue to be a bit more idiosyncratic than the Parisian ones, where it's more of a workshop quality to them, and also the Netherlandish ones, where there's more of a workshop quality to them, which makes them more interesting to me and allows the literary culture that they preserve to be more variegated, right? We can see more happening there for English readers with English books of ours. So there is something of a particularly English story that I want to tell
Unless
here.
they're all really made in the Flanders Alps, but that's it.
Those are right. Not so variegated until they get to England, people start writing them. So yeah, that's two versions of the question. I do have so I can't deal with print, but I do have some things to say about it, and I'm interested in it in some ways. And I am imagining, so I've gotten interested in the past in rebuses in French books of ours, because prayer is written as rebuses in things, how rebuses are just objects, the sound of which allows you to put together words. So that is happening in some printed French books of ours that I think is an interesting phenomenon. But the phenomenon I'm interested in England has to do with Wynkyn de Worde printing books of ours, and he printed one, not the first one he printed, but an early one that I think is a kind of that he saw a market for a sort of literary book of ours because it has more English in it and it has more literature in it than some of the other ones that he's printed. And so I do have a kind of postscript about that one single printed book of ours. Most interestingly, it has replaced the calendar that is the beginning of most books of ours with a poem by Lydgate on the calendar, which itself was written in imitation of the calendar that you would find at the beginning of a liturgical book. So Lydgate's poem, when it appears, it's very cool. So when it appears in manuscript collections, it's often first, and it is laid out with the Dominical letters and golden numbers and all the apparatus of a liturgical calendar. But it's Lydgate's poem, like versified list of saints' feasts, but laid out to look like that first in the book. So obviously imitating in material ways as well as every other way the calendar that you'd find at the beginning of a liturgical book, and most familiar as the beginning of a book of hours. De Worde then makes a book of hours, but takes away the liturgical calendar and puts Lydgate's poem in. So I just find that rather wonderful. So that's one thing that I have to say about print books of hours. But I do think that this one particular De Worde production gives us a hint about what people were looking for in their book of hours, and he at least thought that there were ways in which people were looking for reading material there.
The other thing is about the church discourse.
Right. That is a very good question. I'm going to have to find out. What comes to mind is later church discourses about books of hours, post-Reformation and so forth. But I don't know much about the early. Maybe someone else in the room does about earlier.
No. The church have anything to say about how to use your book of hours and what not to do, and don't write poems to your lover in the margins?
I was very struck by how books actually get used as depicted, say, in the Shipman's Tale, where you've got the monk reading. Firstly, it's called a port horse. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, said in France, but it's used a French word for the port horse.
Yeah.
And it's wandering up and down outdoors reading.
Yeah.
So it's an outdoors reading. And I was wondering if there are points of intersection between your work and Kate Rudy's work, the Dirty Books project, where you can tell where the hands are, where the fingers are, but also if it's been read outdoors, you can actually find elements of pollens and various other things like that. So that's all sort of I suppose her work is very much in the use stage and yours is in the production stage. Where do you see a kind of linkage between those two stages?
Oh, for sure. I am interested in use, absolutely, as well as, I mean, I would see the addition of a poem to the manuscript as a species of use, as well as production, right? So the writing and the reading is, as someone said earlier, in a manuscript culture, right? It's less, there's less of a visible division necessarily. But I do think, yeah, Kate's work is really fascinating to me, and I think that what she's understood from looking at patterns of use based on dirt is that the Office of the Dead is used more than any other part of the Book of Hours. And you would think that it would be the hours, you know, the sort of everyday, the dailiness of the hours, but in fact, it's not that. It's the memorial pieces of it and the Office of the Dead.
Peter, I mean, use, I mean, the question of use, though, comes in, certainly you said that instructions tend to be in the vernacular, right? So you understand the instructions of the vernacular, and then you go to the Latin, which you may or may not understand. And I think of like the Haggadah or any, you know, where it says, you know, you now drink the glass of wine and then say this, and you know, I understand that I drink the glass of wine, have no idea what the Hebrew is saying.
Yeah.
And it seems to me there may be a kind of similar phenomenon going
That
on
often
here.
happens. However, it is also the case that sometimes the rubrics are in Latin and the prayers are in the vernacular.
Go figure. Yeah.
What is also interesting,
Those are
just,
for the native Latin.
that's for the people who are just more
Yeah.
comfortable. In it.
Yeah.
Also, fascinatingly, there are instructions for prayers to be said at Mass. So we think of these as private books, but they're often implicated in liturgical spectacle and liturgical practice in, you know, private use in the pew. But, you know, when the host is elevated, you say this and do this, right? So it's a mode of participation in the common spectacle of the Mass. So that's another way in which the instructions are kind of interesting. Because they can,
Last question or comment goes to
Well, I wanted to resist a little bit, go back to a sort of notion of literacy, what we mean by literacy, which is that it seems to me we tend to have a very Protestant and view of literacy, and a very teleological one, which is you're moving somewhere. You know, that absolutely is what will happen with the Book of Hours. The primer will be the first step. Explicitly, you're going to read the Bible, and so that's the steps you're taking. But the notion of meaning may not be part of what a book is for. In other words, I'm thinking that, and it gains in a way what you were saying, Zach. I mean, I don't think that most people, first of all, the Book of Hours is centrally about the Psalms, and so it's already poetry, it is poetry. And it's going to be chanted, it's going to be sung, you've got hymns very often there. In other words, that part of the whole liturgical program is a song program. And the Protestant objection to this will partly be that we'll say monks, they mutter and they murmur and they chant. In other words, what they're doing is repeating without actually meaning. And so that's a very Protestant view.
Yeah.
Justin, whose name? Justin McCann,
Justin McDaniel.
McCann. So he's written this great book where he actually he studied as a Buddhist monk, so a good Irishman he went to. And what he learns is that he wasn't expected to know what the words meant. In other words, it was actually thought to be negative to know what the words meant. He learned all of the texts he learned them forwards, backwards, then first, third, fifth, seventh word, then backwards, you know, and the whole point was to lock the words in place. It was about mnemonics. And so, in a way, he's developed a critique of our longing for meaning. And I see that as the project of Joyce, for instance. I see the project of Finnegan's Wake. I mean, no one in their right mind is going to read Finnegan's Wake from the beginning to end, but it's a good bedtime book to play with. It's a very good playbook. You know, you can pick up these phrases, Lord have mercy upon us, you know, all these other things. So it's a great. So I'm wondering to what extent books of ours are actually encouraging people. First of all, the images. So they're often very crude images. So you know, when we think of this, and similarly with I was thinking of another when you were thinking about other things, single leaf images, which often have text on pilgrimage.
Yeah.
You go on pilgrimage, and then I've actually seen writing. People are more likely to write very often on those. Even just trying to learn A, you know, that's the kind of thing they'll often write, or you know, they'll try to write their name.
Yeah.
or another kind of game that seems to me a visual game, which is, so that one is about resistance to meaning at the level of sound and playing with sound, actually sounds in your mouth. But then there are visual plays. I've been finding that in signatures, people called Christopher and Christine in the 16th, 17th century, very, very often begin with the Cairo. So you actually don't write out, and Christine de Pizan does it, she writes the Cairo. So it's literally a different alphabet. It's not even, so you're not learning, you're learning a Greek alphabet, but as a fundamental building block for a child is also, because you know what a cross is. And so the cross itself, I don't know whether this is true or not. I think that Joyce believed that the cross, which may have originally been a Christian sign at the end of a letter, you know, in the name of Christ, Cairo, becomes what we put at the bottom of letters now, XXXX, I love you. So it's changed its meaning, but it's a kind of game, it's a play. And I like that in relationship to some of these plays with language that seem to be going on, which seem to be very characteristic of the Middle Ages, and less characteristic when they attack upon puns in the 17th century, the notion you shouldn't pun, you shouldn't play with language. And this is a sort of a very Protestant view. We're reaching for meaning the whole time, as opposed to actually music. If you actually think of aspiring to music and aspiring to images, including the Cairo, which is going to be a way of actually resisting a sort of Protestant drive towards meaning. It's just a thought. Sorry, I mean that. Wasn't really quite I'm sorry.
There's a lot there. Yeah, no, I agree with you that play is visible in these books.
And
And
it's
that's
actually
very
in a way the literary as play.
Yes.
You know, the literary is the opposite of, but it can be the religious as play too. The religious, it's full of play.
It is full of play. That is right. That is right. And repetition, for example, is both playful and meaningless, and also deeply theologically meaningful. Right. So, yeah. So I do think that that's a quality of these books.
Like Hallelujah, you know, you could the amount of songs that just go Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. You know?
Well, there's more to say, but we have 2 books of ours on the table and
Probably not to be played with, but
carefully looked at, and the prize goes to the first person who found something. Yeah. Well, thank you.